You bet, Clint. Thank you, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Um, I think my talk today might be a little bit out of the ordinary to some of the other talks that you're going to hear. And what I'm going to try and provide for you today is a perspective from, I think, the standpoint of a producer and also a producer-owned genetic company. So I work for DNA Genetics, which is owned by a large producer in the state of Nebraska. And as we've looked at this technology and what it's going to involve in the industry, we've really kind of been in this area where we have to think about supporting the technology and we're excited about its future, but we have to look at the realities of its implementation. So hopefully this is kind of a grounded perspective on some of the challenges, both with the implementation of the technology as well as its acceptance by the consuming public. So hopefully today I'll stimulate some thoughts, and I probably have more questions than answers today. So I'd like to talk first about the technology itself, the potential we have for intentional genetic alterations. And I want to use that as a bit of a broad category because I don't think we're limited to gene editing here. There's a lot of opportunities. Some of the challenges we have today in pigs, which will hopefully stimulate some people to look at research in areas that can help us with that. But then also I want to talk about questions and challenges for the industry. So I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on these initial slides on the potential for pigs, because I think most people in this meeting and who are working in this area fully understand that the potential of this type of technology or gene editing technology is just outstanding in terms of being able to create animals that can better handle viral pathogens or bacterial pathogens, improving immune system function, and even looking at other things like inherited abnormalities or what we call nuisance traits. So things that like inguinal hernia or cryptorchid pigs or scrotal hernia that prevent a pig from being a full value pig. But there's a lot of applications of this in livestock, and I put performance at the bottom on purpose because I think that's probably the area that, as a pig producer, that we would like always want more help with in terms of pig performance, but that may not be the best place to start with the application of this technology. There's certainly a lot of potential for people. In the subsequent talk, I'm sure we'll talk about the alpha-gal pig, which is, I know if any of you have a personal friend or relative that has the challenge with alpha-gal, this is an amazing thing for them. But I think it's a perfect example of something we need to keep in mind with these technologies, that ultimately we have to sell this to a consumer, and consumers always, and all people, I think, have a sign on their forehead that says, "What's in it for me?" And when we think about the alpha-gal pig, or things like pitless cherries, seedless raspberries, things that lend themselves to a benefit directly for the consumer, that tends to be much more accepted by a consumer than things that are going to help us as a producer. And I think we can think back to the application of some of the GMO work in crops and so on. And I think there's a lot of examples out there where we have to keep this idea of the consumer in mind. So I think there's tremendous potential. We're very supportive of the technology. But I think there are some challenges in pigs for implementation, and I'm sure this exists in all species. But one of the questions that we have is, how do you introduce a new edit into an existing breeding program and limit its negative impact on that program? Really, when we introduce a new edit, it's major if the major effect of that edit is actually adding a new trait to your breeding program. So, we need to think about, how does that affect the overall value created by, excuse me, a pig breeding program. And the supporting technology to do this today is really not terribly efficient. So I just want to go through a couple of examples. The first one is what you saw in really the prior slide, is we can go through a process of editing embryos, which goes through this step of mosaicism, and does allow us to, have achieve success, but it adds layer or generations to the process. Another option is to edit cell lines, which we can which requires a cloning step, which is another area of technology that may or may not be very favorable with consumers. So we really need ways to create these edits in a more efficient way that lets us get it more immediately into offspring, rather than have to go through multiple generations of cleaning up mosaicism, or perhaps avoiding going through a cloning step, different types of things like that. The other piece of this is that in pigs, all of these require embryo transfer, which in pigs is a surgical process. It's not difficult or impossible to implement, but it has a low and highly variable yield, and just the fact that you have to do the surgery to do it versus cattle, you can use embryo transfer directly, creates a hurdle. So what are the potential impacts on a breeding program? Well, first, the founders can quickly become inferior animals. So as you're making genetic progress in your nucleus, you have a risk of decreasing value in your edited animals. Selection for the edit in the nucleus will slow down the progress in the other traits. So if you introduce that edit at some low allele frequency or moderate allele frequency, you have to put emphasis on it in a program to increase its value. So there's this effect on overall response. And finally, there is a risk to genetic diversity potentially in the nucleus system, because you'll go through a bit of a bottleneck creating a new population of edited animals. That population has to follow all the laws of population genetics and be large enough to make adequate genetic progress, to preserve genetic diversity, and those types of things. So I think all those have to be considered. So just to illustrate that, I put together a couple of really overly simplified scenarios where we'll look at, if we take founder animals in year one and we go through 3 generations, or basically 3 years of breeding out mosaicism and ending up with animals that are ready to basically go into a new nucleus population. I want to try and illustrate what the cost of that is, just to make a key point. So if you look at our average per market pig genetic improvement since over the last 5 or 6 years, it's about $3.50. But you can see that, let's say we have a scenario where in this year 2, we're going to create a new population of pigs with a genetic alteration. And it takes us 3 years to do that. So what you end up with is that population doesn't advance with the rest of the nucleus. So even after that 3-year period, you have this gap of almost $7 between the genetic value of a nucleus herd that didn't have the edit introduced to one where now you finally have animals that have the edit you need, but they're basically 3 years behind the nucleus. So any edit we put in really has to overcome that difference. And if genetic gain in that new population isn't equal, and I just kind of modeled a 10 or 15%, I think 15% drop, that gap can widen. So we need to keep that in mind in terms of the value of the technology. And I just put this out there because you put a producer hat on, they need to understand the impacts of these implementation steps on their operation. This next slide just simply shows the prior slide, but at 65% of the predicted genetic value, just saying, okay, well, what if the value isn't quite that high? What does that look like? But it's still over $4 to $6 difference. So the value of that technology or that edit really needs to overcome that, potentially overcome that gap or add to it. So I think there is some things we need to consider on implementation. So can we look at how do we create homozygous animals after just 1 year? Obviously, today this requires cloning, which I don't personally have an issue with, but that might be an issue for industry adaptation. You can reduce that lag by a year, and you can probably repeat that process and make sure that that new population is not very far behind the original. Another way is just take the long approach, and you introduce edits into your nucleus population, and you select those as traits over time, and maybe you take a decade to bring that new allele to fixation. Another thing that I think we're really interested in, and we're doing some work with a couple collaborators on this, is, how do we look at scenarios just to bypass the nucleus altogether? So can we, pardon me, can we look at implementing the genetic alteration just at the commercial level and leave the nucleus untouched? So if you just simply create superior animals, go through a cloning step, make sure they're 100% edited, and then breed in your multiplication system, you could essentially do all of that transfer at the commercial level. So I think there's some things that we need to look at there. But in conclusion, genetic lag is a real cost to the producer. The value of that genetic alteration should at least equal the value lost. I think how a supplier implements is going to greatly impact the value of these edits, and there's risks to long-term genetic gain, all of which are important to the pork industry. So the last one I'd say is I really feel it's completely infeasible for us to create a new population for every new edit that we create. We're going to have improvements in our implementation technology to adapt this into our current breeding programs, and we're just not there yet. And I think there's ripe opportunities for research in those basic areas. The last thing I'll state, I've already talked about this first major bullet point but the current approval process, I think, definitely has to be addressed, because it's really not very feasible in pigs to do multiple edits through the FDA process. Simply the cost and the time and the path to eventual revenue is just beyond what it needs to be for us to realize value from this. So I'm hopeful that that can eventually be resolved. I want to skip or kind of shift gears here a little bit and talk about, I mentioned earlier that our company is owned by producers, and they spend a lot of time thinking about how this impacts the pork industry, and at a very practical level, what are we going to have to do to implement this technology? And the first one I'll talk about here is actually the cost of the technology. So most production systems, for example, they understand what PRRS or other diseases cost their system. So if they have a large production system and 30% of their system is PRRS positive, they know what that drag on production is and what that cost is. So you can use that information to kind of calculate what is a resistant pig worth to you. And I think that applies to almost any pathogen that we'd be working with, whether it's influenza, PED, other diseases that are out there. But what's the cost of that pathogen? And based on that cost, what's the value of that genetic alteration? What return does the producer want on that investment? So if they decide that PRRS costs them $3 or $4 a pig, do they want to pay $3 or $4, or do they want to pay $2? So there's a return on that investment for them. And I think they also need to consider, lastly, what level of performance are you giving up to obtain that IgA phenotype? So again, no real answers here, but I think we're trying to challenge producers to think through some of these questions on this technology, really to inform us about making investments and bringing these to market. From the consumer standpoint, this is a major issue, mainly because how it impacts demand for pork. We're optimistic, and I think there's good research that would suggest that consumers will understand the benefits when they're educated. I think the challenge is getting consumers educated to actually understand the benefits, which is not an easy task. Obviously, improved animal welfare, contributions to sustainability, improved product attributes. These are all things that the consumer will understand. And if they accept those, I think we'd have a direct path to consumers purchasing this product. But we really believe that transparency is key in all of this. Transparency in this process is going to be a major question. And, I think the industry, no matter what FDA says, needs to ask the question is, should the product be clearly labeled? What should our stance be on this question? We can't afford to focus only on producer benefits. At the end of the day, we can argue the science. I believe in the science. I believe we obviously eat a different complement of DNA in every bite we take. So this is a perfectly safe technology. But ultimately, the consumer decides what we produce. And we have to understand this question. And the only way to do that is to be transparent with what we're doing and ask them and try and gain that knowledge. Demand is obviously paramount for a successful industry. So, a question we have to ask is, a gene-edited product going to increase or decrease overall demand for pork? If within the pork case, if you have two packages side by side and one is labeled as, I guess, conventional or gene-edited, which product commands the higher price? And if gene-edited is the higher price, that's great. If it's not, how does that translate into what that pork is worth to a packer, for example? And what will they be paying producers to produce that product? Is the fact that pork is or could be the first one to market in the barnyard, so thinking of poultry and beef and so on, if we're the first, is that something we need to think about relative to other proteins? So at the end of the day, consumers mostly care about price, quality, and safety. I think that is reflected in almost every study I've ever seen with consumer preferences. Welfare, antibiotic use, and sustainability are not at the top of that list, but they're certainly on the top 10. So where does this technology fit, and how is it going to be accepted, and how is it going to drive demand? And these are really tough questions, and they require a lot of work to get good data. They require a lot of assumptions, but I think we feel the industry owes it to itself to ask them and to pursue these answers. Packers are a key part of this. So packers largely in the US have not made a lot of public statements about how they're going to handle gene-edited pork. The retailers obviously make decisions on consumers, and they're probably not going to decide anything on this until the 11th hour, which creates a problem for us in that we really need to understand how the retailers are going to pull this through or not, because once it's in the system, it's hard to get out. It's not like Paline or other products. Excuse me. The other question is, if it's treated differently, will this pork need to be segregated, whether that's domestically or for an export market? And with it, if there are additional record keeping and traceability issues, who's going to cover that cost? So is that going to just be absorbed by the packer, or is that going to be reflected in producer price? So I think, again, these are very practical, but yet unanswered questions that we need to work our way through. Elena talked a lot about the export markets, and obviously that's extremely important for US pork. Our top trade partners, Mexico, Japan, Canada, South Korea, and China, all have to approve the technology for us to be able to use it. As a matter of fact, if any one of those don't approve it, and we can't have a trusted and reliable segregation of the product, that's going to be a barrier to us. So we need to understand each of those markets and what's going to be required, so we don't end up with artificial trade barriers against U.S. pork. And lastly, like all innovations, this is going to have an impact on efficiency, and but this is a game changer for the livestock industry. This technology, it'll take some time, it'll take a number of years to roll this out, but it'll decrease the impact of a major disease that will increase pork supply by 10 to 20%, which is a dramatic increase in supply. So the question is, what's going to happen to, is there going to be demand to absorb that supply, or is it going to push further consolidation? So I think some things that just have to be considered overall, and again, not a lot of answers here, but questions that we're working hard to. I'm serving on the National Pork Board Task Force on gene editing, and these are questions that producers are asking on that board, in addition to us as a producer. So we're hoping that Pork Board will take the lead in gaining some answers in this area. But I guess to conclude, our position is that we're very much optimistic about the benefits of gene editing. We've ensured us as a genetic supplier in a position to deliver on the technology, because we feel we owe that to our customers to be current on the latest potential technology for them. But we must acknowledge there's significant industry questions. And as a producer, obviously we need transparency. We need industry and consumer engagement and education, and a thorough understanding of the impact on demand. All of these are crucial for us to have a successful launch of gene editing in livestock, so that we can use this freely for years and years to come. So that'll conclude what I have today, and appreciate the opportunity.